Hello and welcome to this primer on inductive arguments, discussing the different forms of the inductive arguments can come in. There are lots of different kinds of inductive arguments, and they exist all over the place. They're probably the most kind of argument that you come across, and you actually rely on them every single day. You go through little bits of reasoning in your head, right? You might think, hey, I'm almost out of milk. I need to go get some more. The store usually has milk, so if I go to the store, then I'll likely be able to buy milk. The conclusion here isn't certain, right? It could be that the store is out of milk, but the store usually does have milk, so it does seem likely that if you went to the store, you would be able to buy milk. Inductive arguments differ from deductive arguments insofar as the conclusions that they have aren't guaranteed by their premises, right? But that doesn't mean that these are bad arguments. The conclusions are more often than not made probable by their premises. One very common form of inductive argument is based on this reasoning process that we might call induction or enumerative induction. Induction is a form of reasoning in which one comes to make a general claim based on a series of instances or particular claims or cases or situations. So you might take, given our previous example, the general claim. You might think grocery stores have milk. Well, that's going to be true, or at least probably true, given a series of other more particular claims, right? Suppose you go and you test. Well, Albertsons, does this Albertsons have milk? Yes, great. Okay, Trader Joe's, does this Trader Joe's have milk? Yes, great. Whole Foods, oh, does this Whole Foods have milk? Yes, great. Cool. Well, I've been to all of these other grocery stores, and each of them has had milk. Well, it seems like I could make the claim that grocery stores have milk, and then maybe make the claim that the next grocery store that I'm going to go to will have milk. Now, of course, none of these are necessarily true, these conclusions, right? It could be that the next grocery store I go to is out of milk. Or it could be that the next grocery store I go to happens to be like a vegan grocery store and so they don't carry milk. You never know, right, in these kinds of situations. But that doesn't mean that these things are sort of off base, right? Because these kinds, the particular claims here do offer some support towards the general claim that grocery stores have milk. From the collection of particulars, ultimately, we don't know sort of the why, though, here. And that's something that's important in thinking about inductive arguments. Inductive arguments don't give you some sort of underlying explanation. What they do is they say, well, look, when you've got, at least in this case, particularly enumerative induction, when you've got lots of instances of things happening in particular cases, well, then you can be justified in leaping to the general, right? So instances like you've got particular grocery stores having milk, and then the general, you say grocery stores in general have milk. When one reasons using this kind of enumerative induction, there's a bunch of things that you also, though, need to keep in mind. In particular, sample size and sample selection. When you make a generalization on the basis of some particular set of instances, it's easy to make that generalization too quickly, to go from too few cases to a large general claim. Suppose you went to all the grocery stores in San Luis Obispo, and they all carried this particular brand of hot sauce. Well, you might make the general claim that all grocery stores carry that particular hot sauce, right? In the same way that you would do so in the case of milk. But you would probably be wrong. Why is that? Well, the issue here is that your sample size is too small. You haven't gotten to most of the grocery stores in the world or the country, and what happens here is you've made a kind of hasty generalization. You made a general claim on the basis of too few members of the sample, too few instances. This is the same issue that often happens, in science, and like in particular, the example that I talked about previously where scientists thought that all swans were white. They hadn't actually gotten a big enough sample size to be able to tell. They were restricted by where they were located, right? They hadn't made it to Australia yet. Another sort of issue that can come up in arguments by induction uh, is sample selection. Sometimes you can actually have a biased sample, even sometimes for at no fault of your own, right? In this case, right, given the example, you chose only stores from San Luis Obispo, and this leads to a kind of bias. Selection bias ultimately occurs when there's some further reason that your selected sample has the property that you're interested in. In this case, right, the hot sauce is made locally, and so it would make sense that it's sold locally, but not everywhere. But that didn't go into your thought process when you were selecting the sample, right? When you were checking all the grocery stores. Probably what went into the sample selection in this kind of case would just be how close all of the grocery stores are to where you're currently living, or something like that, right? And if you're not being careful in thinking about all of the possible things that might bias how you select your sample, then ultimately your argument can be flawed. Yet, while a biased sample is definitely a problem for an inductive argument to hold to, or to result in a certain kind of general conclusion, it's often the case that the argument can be rectified once the bias is recognized by altering the conclusion, right? So in this example that we've been talking about, because the sample only includes grocery stores from San Luis Obispo, the conclusion that all grocery stores within San Luis Obispo, the region, will carry the particular brand of hot sauce. Well, that seems much more probable, right? But that's not what we initially wanted, right? We had to restrict our conclusion now. We had to make it smaller, only localized to a particular region. We wanted to know, for some reason, whether or not all grocery stores were carrying this hot sauce. But ultimately, though, I mean, here what we've done, and what often happens in science is, you come to find out that there was some kind of bias in your sample selection, and so then you have to revise your findings or your conclusions. Take like the recent case of the COVID vaccine, right? Pharmaceutical scientists are always really, really cagey, really, really careful when they claim that the vaccine is effective against the new variants, right? So as the vaccine has been seen to be effective against previous variants, it would seem that it might be effective against future variants, but you never know, right, when you might have a biased sample, right? Maybe the future variants will change in a particular way, and so we're not going to ultimately be justified in assuming that it's going to always work in the future. But here the idea is like, well, we don't know the reason yet for the bias, right? Because it'll have to happen for us to come to find out why the sample may or may not be biased. But ultimately, that doesn't mean we shouldn't. It does seem plausible, at least given this point in time, that the vaccine will continue to be at least minimally effective, somewhat effective against any future variants of the COVID virus. But that, is something that we can still call into question. And especially if, results differ in the future, well, we're going to need to go back to the drawing board. This is all just to say, enumerative induction, again, doesn't give you the answer to the why question, right? So if you're asking things like, well, why would this vaccine continue to work, or why is this hot sauce only at these grocery stores? It doesn't give you the why. But it does give you what seems to be a good reason to say, like, oh, look, it's happened in all of these cases, so it's probably going to happen in the next one. And maybe it's going to happen all the time, right? So it does give you a good reason to sort of make the leap from the particular situations to the general situation. A different form of inductive argument is called an argument by analogy. Now, arguments by analogy are different than arguments by induction, enumerative induction. And arguments by analogy ultimately function given an analogy or an analog, given something that's worthy of comparison. Arguments by analogy, they proceed in a different way where you're not looking at a number of particular things and then making a general claim on the basis of those particular things. It's going to work by comparing things. So take this sort of basic example. Suppose you're a biologist and you find a new animal on an island. Now the animal looks like a kind of dog, but you're not sure, right? Now, in order to study the animal, you need to know how good its sense of smell is, and so you want to be able to stay downwind from it, and so you might reason in this way. Well, the creature looks like a dog, and it acts like a dog, and it can hear people like a dog, right? It can hear things, so it's probably a dog. It probably has a keen sense of smell, like most dogs, right? You haven't gotten a chance to study it, so you haven't gotten a chance to confirm that it's a dog yet, right? Now, here, the idea is that what you've got is a specimen, and you're comparing it, you're analogizing it to something that you already know about, right? An analog, dogs, right? And in this case, basically what you're saying is, well, look, okay, this thing acts this way. It has this property, and this property, similar to this other thing that I know, right? I already know dogs have these properties, so it seems safe for me on this new case to make the leap from saying, okay, well, if it's similar enough in these ways, it's probably similar in this other way. Now, of course, here, once again, there is no answer to the why question. There's no answer to why this new animal would also have a good sense of smell similar to dogs, right? That's further information that we'd have to know. Now you kind of might feel it in your gut, right? Well, you want to explain, right? You want to explain, oh, well, it's got something to do with evolution, and because dogs evolved to have these keen senses of smell. Yes. But that's not where we are yet. This kind of argument by analogy is just a very simple form of reasoning, whereby which if you take two things and you're comparing them, and in one case, something that you know a lot about has all these different kinds of properties, well, then in the other case, if it seems like you can match a bunch of the properties, you can probably infer from that the further property that you're interested in, right? In the past, dogs all have these particular traits together, right? They can smell a certain amount, like they're good at smelling, they're good at hearing, like they act in these different ways. So because you know all about that, you can infer to this further property, or I mean, really to the with the new case that it is also going to act in this particular way, or that it is also going to have this particular trait. The third kind of inductive argument that we're going to be discussing is called abduction, or inference to the best explanation. This kind of inductive argument is like an entire way of thinking, and it operates differently from both enumerative induction and argument by analogy. On an abductive way of reasoning, one takes all of the available evidence that there is for a particular phenomena, and takes all of the available explanations that could possibly explain the phenomena or the evidence that you have, the data, right? You've got a lot of data, and you've got a lot of explanations of the data, and then what you're trying to do here is, upon reflection, recognize which of the explanations best accommodates all of the data, best explains everything. And usually upon reflection, given certain understandings of what it means for something to best explain, it'll become clear which of the explanations, either one or a few, are ultimately the best ones. And from that, you can then sort of make the inference. Hopefully there's only one explanation, and then if you make the inference, the leap from, okay, here's all the data, this is the best explanation of all the data, so I should believe in this explanation. When it comes to thinking about what the best explanation is, however, there's lots of ways to rank what counts as best. And we're going to talk about this more later in the class, but sort of there are obvious cases, and that will kind of come up for thinking about these things. There's obvious cases for understanding how well an explanation can handle sort of the available evidence or the phenomena, right? We can think about like whether or not an explanation is testable, right? Whether or not you can actually go out and see if it shows one thing or another. You can see whether or not an explanation actually coheres with already held background beliefs and assumptions, maybe in a science or something like that. Here's a sort of interesting and fun example. There was a time at which people thought that the Earth was the center of the universe, or at least the center of the solar system. But that was problematic when we started studying the stars. And of course, there's like the famous like Galileo and all of these other people that were suggesting, well, look, a geocentric universe, or at least solar system, isn't very plausible because of the way that all of the planets move. What's much more plausible is a heliocentric system, right? And as you can see, right, the heliocentric system is much more elegant in a way than the geocentric system. Here we're looking basically at what would happen, what all of the planets would have to be doing if geocentrism was correct. This is given how we view them in the night sky. They would literally have to move in all of these funny loops. Whereas on the heliocentric explanation, they simply, go around in circles like this. The sort of normal way of thinking about things that we think about now. Now, of course, it's possible that planets do move in this geocentric way, and that the sun moves around the Earth in this way. But it's not like it's a possible explanation of the data, where the data is just what we see in the night sky and how the stars and the planets move above us. But that explanation isn't very good, right? Why isn't it very good? Well, because it requires us to postulate a lot of weird things about how gravity works, weird things about why the planets are rotating in the ways that they are. Whereas it's just what we might think of as like a mathematical nightmare. Whereas it's a very straightforward explanation, and it's somewhat elegant, and it's just kind of looks nice, and it seems more plausible in certain respects to accept heliocentrism, right? The heliocentric model of how the the solar system operates. Now, when thinking about this, right, like think about way back when everybody thought, well, everybody had a lot of like religious beliefs and thought like, oh, well, God created man and man must be the center of the universe. Well, that's going to ultimately conflict with, right, the heliocentric model. And so you can kind of get a feel for why at certain points in time, certain kinds of explanations were thought to be better than others. And then that changed over time, right? As we got better and better data, we started getting better and better, experiments. We started looking at the stars a lot more and getting more high-powered telescopes. But yeah, so the idea here is just to show that the heliocentric model is a better explanation than the geocentric model of the data that we have from astronomy. Next time we're going to be covering, or next time we talk about inductive arguments, we're going to be covering the informal fallacies. Informal fallacies are all of the different ways that one could reason problematically in an inductive way. Things like making hasty generalizations, red herrings, which is an interesting one, appeals to authority, and a lot more.